It's November 1455, and inside Bletsoe Castle in Bedfordshire, something that should never happen is about to take place. Lady Margaret Beaufort, barely 12 years old, still a child by any reasonable measure, is being dressed for her wedding to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. He's 24 years old, a battle-hardened nobleman, and half-brother to King Henry VI. Margaret is so small and slight that the elaborate wedding gown has to be pinned and adjusted just to fit her child-sized frame. Picture this terrified little girl, probably not even understanding what marriage really means, being prepared like a sacrifice for political ambition. She's shaking, whether from cold or fear. No one bothers to ask. This isn't a fairy tale romance. This is medieval politics at its most ruthless, where children are treated as pawns in a deadly game of power, and one little girl is about to pay an unimaginable price that will haunt her for the rest of her life. Margaret Beaufort's story is one of the most remarkable transformations in medieval history, from victim to victor, from powerless child to kingmaker. But it all begins with a horror that no child should ever endure. Margaret was born around May 31st, 1443, into a world that would steal her childhood before she could even understand what she was losing. During the brutal Wars of the Roses, her father, John Beaufort, was the first Duke of Somerset with royal blood, which made Margaret incredibly valuable and incredibly vulnerable. When she was just 6 months old, her father died under mysterious circumstances, leaving Margaret an orphan baby who would never know what it felt like to be truly safe. By the time Margaret turned 6 years old, she was already trapped in the nightmare of medieval political marriages. She was first married to John de la Pole, son of the Duke of Suffolk. This marriage was annulled when Margaret was around 9 years old, freeing her to be sold off again to the highest bidder. Enter Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. Edmund was about 24 years old when he set his sights on 12-year-old Margaret Beaufort. For Edmund, this marriage meant gaining control of Margaret's vast estates. For Margaret, this marriage meant the end of any hope for a normal childhood. The wedding took place in November 1455 at Bletsoe Castle. Picture the scene: a massive medieval ceremony with hundreds of nobles in attendance, elaborate feasts, music, dancing, everything except any consideration for the fact that the bride is a terrified 12-year-old girl who probably doesn't fully understand what's happening to her. After the wedding, Edmund took Margaret to his estates in Wales, far from her family and everything familiar. Here's where the story takes its most disturbing turn. While it was common for noble children to be married young for political reasons, it was generally understood that the marriage wouldn't be consummated until the girl reached puberty and was physically capable of bearing children safely. Edmund Tudor didn't wait. Despite Margaret being small and slight for her age, despite her obvious terror, despite the fact that she was barely 13, Edmund consummated the marriage. Think about that horror: a grown man forcing himself on a terrified child who had no understanding of what was happening to her, no power to refuse, no one to protect her. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Margaret became pregnant almost immediately, and by early 1456, at just 13 years old, she found herself carrying a child while her body was still that of a girl. The physical agony was nothing compared to the emotional trauma. She was scared, alone, and trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. But before Margaret could give birth, her world collapsed again. Edmund Tudor was captured during fighting in Wales and died in November 1456, probably of plague. Margaret, now 13 years old, 7 months pregnant, and completely alone, suddenly found herself a widow trapped in a Welsh castle while civil war raged around her. Think about Margaret's situation for a moment. She's a 13-year-old girl, heavily pregnant, widowed, and trapped in Wales while civil war rages around her. Her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor, became her guardian, but he was also a military commander fighting desperately to keep the Lancastrian cause alive. On January 28, 1457, at Pembroke Castle in Wales, Margaret went into labor. She was still just 13 years old, probably no more than 5 feet tall, and weighing perhaps 90 pounds. Picture this terrified child, screaming in agony as her body was torn apart by a process it was never meant to endure. The midwives probably didn't expect her to survive. Girls her age often didn't. The birth was a nightmare of pain and terror that lasted for hours. Margaret's young body was almost certainly damaged by the experience, and the trauma, both physical and emotional, would haunt her forever. The complications from this birth left her unable to have more children, robbing her of the large family she might have wanted, and forcing her to pour all her maternal love into one precious child. But both mother and child survived, which was remarkable given the circumstances. The baby was named Henry after the king, and this child, born to a 13-year-old widow in a Welsh castle during a civil war, would grow up to become Henry VII, King of England. Margaret's recovery from childbirth was a slow descent into heartbreak. She was dealing with physical injuries that would never fully heal, but the emotional wounds cut even deeper. She'd lost her husband, nearly died giving birth, and now faced the most devastating decision of her young life. For the safety of both mother and child, the heartbreaking decision was made to separate them. Imagine the agony, a 13-year-old girl who had already lost everything being forced to give up the one person who meant everything to her. Little Henry would remain in Wales under Jasper Tudor's protection, while Margaret would return to England, her arms empty and her heart shattered. She didn't know if she'd ever see her baby again, didn't know if either of them would survive the civil war raging around them. The separation felt like dying. Within a year of giving birth, Margaret was married for the third time to Sir Henry Stafford, son of the Duke of Buckingham. This marriage was different for the first time in her life. Margaret found herself with a husband who treated her with genuine kindness and respect. They lived quietly at Woking Palace, and by all accounts, they developed a genuinely affectionate relationship. Margaret and Henry Stafford had no children together, and the reason broke Margaret's heart every single day. Her reproductive system had been destroyed by that traumatic first pregnancy, robbing her of the chance to experience normal motherhood. Every month brought fresh reminders of what had been stolen from her at 13. She channeled all her maternal love into her son, Henry Tudor, who remained in exile in Wales. But the distance between them was a constant ache that never healed. In 1471, Henry Stafford was mortally wounded fighting at the Battle of Barnet and died from his wounds, leaving Margaret widowed for the second time at just 28 years old. But she was no longer the powerless child she had been. Margaret had spent over a decade learning how the political game was played. Margaret's third marriage was to Thomas Stanley, one of the most powerful nobles in England. This was an alliance that Margaret engineered herself, designed to give her real political power and protection. As Lady Stanley, she controlled enormous wealth and had access to military resources that could actually make a difference in the struggle for the English throne. Throughout the 1470s and early 1480s, Margaret lived with constant fear and heartbreak. Every political development could mean death for her son. Every failed plot could result in his execution. She maintained secret correspondence with Henry in exile, but the letters were dangerous for both of them. Sometimes months would pass without word, and Margaret would lie awake, wondering if her child was still alive. The years of separation were torture. Margaret missed watching her son grow up, missed teaching him, missed holding him. She knew him only through occasional letters and rare, dangerous meetings. Other mothers complained about their children's behavior. Margaret would have given anything just to see her son misbehave. The political maneuvering during this period wasn't just brilliant strategy. It was a mother's desperate attempt to create a world where she could finally be reunited with her child. She maintained secret correspondence with Lancastrian exiles, where her son Henry was living in precarious exile. She cultivated relationships with nobles who were dissatisfied with Yorkist rule. Most remarkably, she began secret negotiations with Elizabeth Woodville, the widow of Edward IV. The disappearance and probable murder of the princes in the Tower in 1483 created the opportunity Margaret had been waiting for. Richard III's usurpation of the throne horrified many English nobles and created widespread opposition to his rule. Margaret saw her chance and began actively plotting rebellion. Margaret coordinated plans for simultaneous uprisings across England. She used her extensive network of contacts to arrange financing, gather intelligence, and coordinate timing. The first attempt in 1483 failed, but Margaret didn't give up. She continued plotting and preparing for another attempt. Margaret's moment finally came in 1485, when she helped orchestrate the invasion that would put her son Henry on the English throne. Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven in Wales with a small army. As Henry marched across Wales and into England, his forces grew as local nobles joined his cause. The decisive battle came at Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485. Margaret's careful political preparation paid off in the most dramatic way possible. At the climactic moment of the battle, Thomas Stanley and his brothers switched sides, attacking Richard's forces from behind. Richard III fought to the death, and when he fell, Margaret's son Henry Tudor became King Henry VII. Margaret had spent nearly 30 years planning and working toward this moment, driven not by political ambition but by a mother's love. The 13-year-old girl who gave birth to Henry in a Welsh castle, who was forced to give him up, who spent decades fearing for his life, had finally brought her son home. When they embraced after the victory at Bosworth, Margaret wept for all the lost years, for all the fear, for all the heartbreak that had led to this moment. As the mother of the new king, Margaret became one of the most powerful people in England virtually overnight. Henry VII granted her the unprecedented title, My Lady the King's Mother, and she wielded influence that rivaled many crowned monarchs. She controlled vast estates, dispensed royal patronage, and essentially functioned as an unofficial co-ruler. But Margaret didn't stop there. She became a major patron of education, founding Christ's College and St. John's College at Cambridge University. She supported the printing of religious texts and became deeply involved in religious reform. She translated religious works from Latin into English, making them accessible to a broader audience. Margaret lived to see her son's reign secure and successful. Henry VII proved to be one of England's most effective kings, rebuilding royal finances and establishing diplomatic relations with European powers. In 1509, the cruelest blow of all fell upon Margaret. Henry VII died unexpectedly, and Margaret's world shattered once again. The son she had fought so hard to protect, the child she had been separated from for so many years, the king she had helped create, he was gone. Margaret was devastated beyond measure. She had outlived the child she gave birth to at 13, and the grief was unbearable. She lived just long enough to see her grandson Henry VIII crowned king, ensuring that the Tudor succession would continue. But her heart was broken. She died on June 29, 1509, just a few months after losing her beloved son. Some say she died of grief, a mother's heart finally giving out, after a lifetime of suffering. Looking back at Margaret Beaufort's extraordinary life, what's most heartbreaking is the price she paid for every triumph. Yes, she became powerful, but that power was built on a foundation of childhood trauma that never fully healed. Yes, she put her son on the throne, but she lost decades of his childhood and had to watch him from afar for most of his life. Yes, she founded colleges and reformed religion, but she did it all while carrying the emotional scars of a girl who was robbed of her innocence at 13. The trauma she endured, the forced marriages, the pregnancy at 13 that nearly killed her, the separation from her son, the constant fear for his safety shaped every decision she made for the rest of her life. She channeled that pain into purpose, but the pain never really went away. Every political victory was shadowed by personal loss. Margaret Beaufort's story isn't ultimately about triumph over tragedy. It's about how tragedy transforms us, how it can drive us to extraordinary achievements while leaving wounds that never fully heal. The 13-year-old girl who gave birth to Henry Tudor in agony and terror became one of the most powerful women in English history, but she paid a price in heartbreak that no crown could ever compensate for. The pregnant 13-year-old became the mother of kings, but she never stopped being that frightened girl who lost her childhood to men's ambitions. Her legacy is remarkable, but her life reminds us that some victories come at costs too terrible to truly calculate.